thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out today, and in particular, thank you to Chris Russell for the invitation to come. Just great to be here. Actually, little known fact is that my very first consulting job out of graduate school was for the Kennedy School, where I was hired by Bill Clark to do an assessment, a review of what do we know about how the public thinks about sustainability all around the world. So it was a fabulous way to get started, and so I still owe a debt of gratitude to this school for that beginning. I'm going to talk today about climate change in the American mind. So let me begin by first of all giving you a sense as to what we do at the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. And really I want to emphasize that we do two main things. And mostly what I'll talk about today is our research, but we also do a lot of public outreach and engagement as well. So on our research, we're really interested in understanding how does the public respond to this issue? What do they understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions to climate change? How do they perceive the risks, so the likelihood and severity of different kinds of impacts? What kinds of policies do they support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are Americans engaged in or willing to engage in around climate and energy? And by behaviors, we look at how people use energy and save energy at home and on the road. Americans' consumer behavior. Will they reward and punish companies for their activities around climate change? We look at how we talk about it, our communication patterns among our own social networks of friends and family. We look at social norms, these unwritten cultural rules that guide so much of our lives. Just think of how social norms in this country have changed so dramatically around smoking. It used to be cool and glamorous. Now many smokers are resigned to the outdoors, hiding in corners. Complete shift of the meaning and the cultural acceptability of that particular behavior. And then last but not least is political behavior. Not just will people support policy or not, but will they vote for certain politicians or not? And even more importantly, what we're spending a lot of time on these days is their willingness to actually get engaged as citizens, to actually demand that the political system take this issue seriously and take action. As was said before, though, we're scientists. So in the end, our ultimate question is why? What are those psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get very engaged with this issue, some people are kind of apathetic, and some people are downright dismissive? We'll come back to all of that. And then to answer those questions, we look at this at many different scales. So today I'll be mostly talking about here in the United States, where we've conducted over a dozen national scale, in-depth studies of how Americans think about these issues. But we've also been doing a lot more work lately internationally. We recently did the first study in China, first study in India, a few others. And then over the past number of years, I've been working with the Gallup World Poll with just a few questions, but looking across about 130 countries around the world. So just trying to see those broad scale patterns, and I'm happy to talk about those later on. And then we've also been doing increasingly smaller scale stuff in particular states or even in particular cities. And then for about 5 years, I've been working with Inuit Eskimo communities in the Arctic who are literally on the front lines. I mean, climate change is not an abstraction, it's in the front yard. So how do they respond to those very in-your-face kind of threats? But what we also do, and I won't talk as much about this unless people are interested, is we do a lot to try to bridge this gap between what we know in the scientific community and what the public understands about it. And one of our main ways of doing that is the Yale Forum on Climate Change in the Media. We have a stable of independent journalists who basically go out and tell some of the key stories that are not being told by the mainstream press, as well as some really excellent short videos that are interviews spliced with great graphics of how the climate system works, how do things like the polar vortex work, and so on. And I really encourage you to come take a look at those. And we'll be doing much more on this over the future. A great project, which I'd be happy to talk about if anyone wants to ask me about it in the Q&A, is about engaging the nation's broadcast meteorologists as climate communicators, as climate educators. This is a really cool project we've been doing now for about 4 or 5 years. Happy to talk more about that. And then for a number of years, we've been working with science museums across the country to engage their local communities in actually going out and being scientists, measuring, monitoring, tracking local changes as part of this issue. Okay. I've got to say, of course, that all of what we do is only because we have just an incredible team of partners, not just at Yale, but all over the country. In particular, our good dear friends at George Mason University are partners with us on a lot of the stuff I'll be showing you today. But lots of other institutions, including some colleagues here at Harvard.
Which part of Harvard?
The Kennedy School. That particular is a reference to Joe Alden, who's an economist here, who we publish with. Okay, and then our sponsors, without which, of course, none of this would be possible. Okay, so with all that, let me just start by saying that it would be wonderful, it would be great if every American could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101. They could all have a basic undergraduate semester-long course on here's how the climate system works, here are the causes, here are the consequences, here are the potential solutions to climate change. But my proposition to you is that that is never going to happen. It's just never going to happen. And I'm not saying that we don't do everything we can, because in fact there are millions of people who do want to know more. They want to know about the details. They want to know about how does this work. And they're asking the important questions, and as a scientific community, we need to do all we can to go more than halfway to meet them and answer those questions as clearly and straightforwardly as we can. Absolutely. But that's not most people. Okay? They don't have the time, they don't have the interest, they don't have the background, they don't have the training. So my question then is, if they've got limited shelf space in their mind devoted to this issue of climate change, what would you want them to know? Let's say you've got enough room for 5 ideas. What 5 ideas would you want there? Would you want 400 parts per million? Would you want to know how the carbon cycle works? Okay. What exactly would you want to know? Well, that's an open question, but as terms of what we have thus far learned in our work, is that we think that there are 5 key beliefs that you can actually say in just 10 words for all the complexity and all the difficulties of climate change. And it is a big and sprawling and complex scientific problem. But in the end, for most people, what they need to know is some very core meta ideas, because these ideas are important for understanding the world today, and just as importantly, are important for helping them make informed decisions about this into the future. Because the truth is, we're going to be dealing with this issue for decades. Even if we were taking serious, strong action right this very second, we're still going to be working on this issue for decades. And so, as best we can do this, and actually a friend of mine has converted this to a haiku, but I won't give you that version, is that it's simple. It's real. It's happening. It's us. To extend that, yes, the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years, but this time it's different. This time it's human activities that are causing this change. It's bad. It's bad now, and it's going to get much, much worse if we don't start taking action. That the expert community, the people who study this day in and day out, are in widespread agreement about some core facts about this, in particular, that yes, it is real, that it is us, and that it's bad, about which there's little to no scientific dispute. But last and not least is crucially that there's hope, which I'll say as a community of the climate expert community, I think we've been actually pretty lousy at doing this. We've done a far better job of helping people understand the problem and the threat than we have about the solutions. Okay, so with that in mind, how we do it? Where's the American public as of right now? Well, this first one is simply its real question. Is global warming happening? And what I've done here is I've taken the results from all the survey organizations that have asked a version of this question repeatedly over the years. Okay, so we've got Gallup, Pew, us, Stanford, and Brookings. Now, we all asked the question using different wording and different response categories and so on, and that's why you see differences in our estimates. But that's not the important pattern I want you to look at. What I want you to look at is what happens is that we have a high water mark back in 2007, and then they all show the same downwards trend. When you average all these together, it's about 14 percentage point drop. Bottoming out in 2010, and since then it's been coming back up slowly, not back up to where we were back here, but coming back. So a big rise in these years right here, a big drop, and then a slow coming back. And we'll see the same pattern over and over again. Likewise with this. Do Americans understand that climate change is mostly human caused? It was 57% back in 2008. It dropped 10 points, where it has since burbled along pretty much consistently right around 47 as of last November. Though we've seen a slight uptick in just the past year in those that think it's natural.
What year was Al Gore's movie?
Al Gore's movie was 2006? Yeah. And so that's part of that ramp up. Now, it wasn't just Al Gore's movie, right? I mean, there's the IPCC report in 2007. You've got Arnold Schwarzenegger doing pioneering work out in California, kind of thumbing his nose at the Bush administration. This is back when George W. Bush was president. So that generated a whole bunch of interesting stories. So there's a lot of things. It wasn't just inconvenient truth, but clearly it did play an important role too. Okay? Crucially, only about 4 in 10 Americans understand that most scientists think global warming is happening. Now note that this question is only asking, do they agree that it's happening? Not do they think it's human caused, not do they even think it's a bad thing, just do they think it's happening, about which there really is no debate. Even most of the hardcore professional dismissives agree that the world is warming. Okay? And yet only 4 out of 10 Americans believe that. In fact, even more to the point when we ask them to estimate the proportion of climate scientists that think this is true, only 1 out of 5 Americans guess that it's more than 80% of the experts. Okay. Now, this is not by accident. This is not by accident. In fact, you heard, I think, was it last week, the panel with Naomi Oreskes. She has done as much as anyone to articulate and show the history of how this happened. Is that literally the exact same playbook, some of the same chapter and verse out of the playbook of the tobacco wars was lifted up by some of the same scientists and grafted right into the climate change debate. And that is that if you can continue to confuse people and make them believe that the experts haven't reached agreement that this is even a problem, then you stall action. And of course it makes perfect sense. You know, most of us are not experts in these issues. I mean, I know a lot about climate change because I've been studying it for 20 years. But you ask me to assess the risks of genetic engineering or nanotechnology and so on, I mean, I'm not really qualified. You know, and all of us look to experts to help us navigate through this increasing landscape of risk that we face. And if your perception is that the experts are still fighting with each other about whether the problem even exists, then most people's natural tendency is to say, well, you know, I kind of think it might be okay, or it might be a problem, but you know what, they'll work on it, they'll figure it out, and when they figure it out, they'll let me know, and then I'll take it seriously. Okay? So it's safer to wait. Unfortunately, it's not. Moreover, we know that very few Americans are very worried about this issue. Again, a 13-point drop in that critical time period, but even as of last November, only 15% of Americans say that they're very worried about this issue. So why is that? Why don't we worry about it? Well, one of the main reasons, and we've seen this consistently over the years, is that many Americans think of climate change as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears, small island countries, maybe some developing countries, not the United States, not my state, not my city, not my friends and family, or any of the people I care about. And so it's seen as distant, spatially distant. Okay, so even if you accept it's real, it just seems like, okay, it's another of those issues. You know, we'll get to it when it's a higher priority. We'll get to it later. We'll put it on the back burner, not knowing that the pot's boiling over on the back burner. Okay. And this means, as a result, that we tend not to prioritize the issue. And so this is data from the Pew Research Center. We've actually done the same thing ourselves. We found the exact same pattern. And that is that when you ask people, what are your top priorities for President of Congress, this is just as of about a month ago, you know, what's at the top? The economy and jobs, right? Of course. Where's global warming? Way down here at the bottom where it's always been. And importantly, when you look at the percent change since 2007, it's dropped 9 percentage points since then. Again, part of that overall decline that we've been looking at. But it's also true of the environment, also true of energy. whereas these soared to the top. Okay, now we have one other way that we get at this question, and it's one of my favorite research tools and techniques. And I won't go into the underlying psychology, but I have a completely non-representative sample of the American public here today, so let's play along. Here's the question, form of free association. What's the first thought or image that comes to your mind when you hear the word global warming? I don't say anything. Okay, now just out of curiosity, please raise your hand if you had anything come to your mind about melting ice. You know, sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, glaciers around the world. Look up high, and now look around. Okay? Yes, that's exactly what we find. And believe me, I see this same pattern happen when I'm talking to a room full of climate scientists. Okay? It's stunning how well my mental telepathy works. And that's what we find. Now this data I'm showing you right here is from 2003. We'll come back to that in a moment. So what do we find is that Americans first and foremost think about climate change as having something to do with melting ice. Again, glaciers melting around the world, Arctic sea ice retreating, ice shelves breaking off Antarctica, etc. Now, that's partly because when you're doing a media story, one of the hardest things to do is what's the picture, right? What's the icon of climate change or global warming? And I think usually they go straight to the ice because it's easy, it's graphic, and you know, if you got one of those wonderful video clips of a calving glacier, I mean, you've got giant pieces of ice falling off, big sound, big splash of water. It's great television. Okay? And yes, Americans do associate it with that. Now this has a benefit, and that is that it takes advantage of and it aligns with a mental model that we all have built up inside of us through repeated experience. Okay? And any of us knows, we take a glass of ice outside on a warm summer day, what happens? It melts. So you show people pictures of melting ice around the world, and they already get it, right? You don't have to explain anything that they don't already understand in their bones. Okay? It makes sense intuitively. This is what's happening. But it also comes at a cost. Okay? Now, all those people who were thinking of melting ice, could you put your hands back up for me again and keep them up high? Now, keep your hand up if you live on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, in Antarctica, or next to a melting glacier. Really? Nobody? Okay, it reinforces the sense that this is distant. This is happening at the poles. This is happening at high altitudes. It's not happening where we live. Okay? And if you notice, most of those pictures of melting ice don't have any people in it. They might have some polar bears in it, which has its own set of issues. Okay? All right. Then a lot of people think of rising temperatures, global warming, temperatures going up. A lot of people who confuse and conflate global warming with the ozone hole, and I could go off on this. It's very common that many people think they are the same thing, or that the ozone hole is actually causing global warming. No, they are not. Wrong. Different issues. Some give alarmist images, which are catastrophic, apocalyptic, death of the planet, all things dead, like after a nuclear war. They go way beyond the worst case scientific scenarios. I mean, this is a bad, serious problem, but I think the planet's going to be fine. Well, some parts of the planet will be fine. Then references to flooding and sea level rise, changes in the overall climate, impacts on non-human nature, and then a set that we call naysayers. And the naysayers are very interesting because they have different kinds of responses. Some say, it's just not happening. It's just complete dismissal. Some say, well, it might be happening, but I don't think it's been proven yet. So they're kind of interacting with the evidence. Some doubt based on their own personal experience. You know, it was 0 degrees here the other day. There's your proof that global warming is not happening. Some blame it on media or environmentalist hype. And then some are what we lovingly call conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax. It's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, it's Al Gore and his friends trying to get rich, and many, many other such types of claims. Now, the one other thing I want to say about this slide is what we have never seen, and we ask this question twice a year. We've been doing it for over a decade. And what I never see in this, nobody ever connects climate change with impacts on human health. Nobody says anything about infectious diseases. Nobody says anything about asthma or air quality. Nobody even says anything about the human health consequences of extreme events, like heat waves or storms or tornadoes or whatever. And moreover, when we ask people in an actual question to tell us what are the risks of climate change to human health, half of the country won't even guess. They'll just say, I don't know. Then put that into context when we also ask them what's the likelihood we'll be abandoning major cities along our coastlines because of sea level rise, they'll make a guess about that. But they won't even make a guess about the health consequences. And those that do generally underestimate by an order of magnitude. They say that by 2050, maybe a few thousand people around the world will be harmed by climate change, not millions. And yet when we do experimental work and actually give people that information, we find they resonate with it. Because it's not about polar bears. It's about us. It really is about us. It's also about polar bears and all the other species. But it's also really about us. More could be said there. Okay, so remember, now this is where we were in 2003. So where were we as of 2010? This is how things have changed. Okay. Now one of those has clearly changed much more than the others, and that's the naysayers. And remember, these are unprompted. We haven't even used the words global warming in the study until they see this and they free associate. This is what's at the top of their mind, at the tip of their tongue. And half of these are conspiracy type responses. Okay. All right, so what's going on here? Why this decline that we saw from 2007 to 2010? Well, we're actually actively working this out right now in a couple different papers, but to get into it, we've got this main hypothesis that there was a bit of a perfect storm. First of all, the economy. 2008 is when the housing bubble pops and the financial crisis hits, and unemployment surges up over 10%, and unemployment and jobs soar to the top of public priorities where they have dwarfed everything else ever since. And when you've got foreclosure foreclosure signs on the homes on your block, that's in your face in a way that for many people climate change is not. So the economy is certainly a macro condition that has changed things. But what's less recognized is what happened to media coverage. Now, my colleague Max Boykoff tracks newspaper coverage over time, and he found that since 2007, newspaper coverage dropped by about 2/3. And nightly network news coverage, just what Bob Rule tracks, like CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, dropped 90%. Now, this is an issue that, look, we can all look outside right this very second, and there is CO2 pouring out of tailpipes, pouring out of buildings, pouring out of smokestacks. There's CO2 coming out of your mouth and nose this very second. But until I said it, you weren't even conscious of it. Why? Because it's invisible. Likewise, the causes and the consequences of climate change are invisible to most of us. We wouldn't even know about it without science. Okay? And unfortunately, most Americans don't know a scientist. In fact, there have been studies where we've asked, not we, but our colleagues have asked people to name a living scientist, and most people can't. And the most often cited living scientists are Einstein and Darwin, if only they were still alive. They don't know a scientist personally. They don't read the peer-reviewed literature. They've never even heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm not kidding, they really haven't. Maybe 14–15% of Americans have heard of the IPCC. So when the media doesn't report this issue, it's literally out of sight and out of mind. It's not that people have completely forgotten it, but it's no longer salient. And I got one other way to get at this. And this
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Since your name is associated with articles on 3 of those 6 hypotheses,
Yeah.
inevitably I'm wondering if you would have any preference or belief that any of these 6 hypotheses is more effective than the others.
Yeah, I do. I'll come to that.
Good.
Okay, the other point I wanted to make about media coverage is the fact that we actually don't even talk about it that much. Okay, so we actually have another paper just about to be submitted right now that we're calling the signal to noise problem. Okay? Even in 2007, the banner year, when public engagement with climate change had reached its high water mark, the proportion of all major news stories, of the entire news hole that was devoted, that even mentioned the words climate change, was 0.88%. Less than 1% of the stories in 2007 even mentioned the word climate change. And I'm not even talking about whether they were good stories or bad stories or had false balance or actually told a good compelling thing about climate change. Well, let's leave quality out. Just quantity, less than 1%. And by 2011, which is the last data we have, it had dropped to 0.1%. 0.1% of all coverage. Okay? By contrast, here's 2009, and I love these maps, and what you see here are the big stories that were going on in 2009. The economic crisis all over the place, healthcare reform, the auto industry, Obama's transition, Afghanistan, Michael Jackson's death, very important. Down here, Balloon Boy. Remember Balloon Boy? Yeah? Tiger Woods adultery, all kinds of really important stories. What's not on here, it doesn't even make it, is climate change. In fact, even the environment doesn't make it on this list. Okay? So I think for all the hand-wringing that we do about the quality of news coverage, and it is important, I'm not denying that at all, but I think we often miss the elephant that's not in the room. And that is that we just don't talk about it. We just don't even see the word that much. Okay? Especially, and that's hard for somebody like me who lives inside the green bubble. I mean, I subscribe to Green Wire and Climate Wire, and I'm getting climate news in me all the time, and I'm going, wow, look at all this great coverage. That's not most people. That is not most people. Okay. We also had unusual cold weather in those 2 years, so 2009 and 2010. First it was, I was getting backwards, Snowmageddon and then Snowpocalypse. We're running out of those. And we know that some people who don't know much about the issue will change their views based on their most recent experience of the weather. So when the polar vortex happens, we know that some people think, gosh, that doesn't seem like global warming, so no, I don't think it's real. But those same people, when they suddenly go through an extreme heat wave, will go, oh gosh, that does seem like global warming, so yeah, maybe it is real. Right? I'll talk a bit more about that. Yeah?
Well, one of the flip sides of global warming is decreasing decreasing temperatures in certain parts of the world.
Sure.
And so, do you think the word global warming itself has done tremendous disservice to the
There it is. It's always the very first question. Global warming versus climate change. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. Okay. I'm not going to say a lot about this because you already heard a whole seminar about this, and that is that there's been a very effective industry that has been working very hard for decades to undermine the science. Also, what happens in this time period is the climategate pseudo-scandal. Okay, the hacked emails out of the University of East Anglia, the cherry-picking of certain phrases and twisting them to imply that scientists were somehow making things up. We did a study, published it, and showed that about 12% of Americans either became less convinced that climate change is happening or lost trust in scientists as a result of this story. Okay? But what's interesting is that that effect was not universally spread across the country. It was highly concentrated among people who tended to be conservative, Republican, and to get their news and information from Fox and Rush and so on. So what you're beginning to see here is this increasing fragmentation of our media landscape, these building of increasing echo chambers where audiences and news sources kind of reinforce each other in their dispositions. And then last but absolutely not least is increased political polarization, because the other thing that happens in this critical time period is that Obama and the House of Representatives pass Waxman-Markey. Okay? The first major comprehensive climate legislation passes one of the houses of Congress. This is no longer abstract. This is no longer some esoteric policy debate. There's real policy on the table. There are probably trillions of dollars at stake in the United States taking on comprehensive comprehensive legislation. Okay? So the forces against this go into overdrive. And they actually are very good at what they did within that context. And that political cues, the communication from political leaders, really ramps up in this time period, with the tax on cap and trade in particular. And much more could be said about that. Okay. So then why the rebound since then? What's been going on there? Well, first and foremost, the U.S. economy and unemployment are getting better. We have the ability to now expand our attention beyond the immediate crisis. But also, interestingly, there was more media coverage in these 2 years, in large part because 2011 and 2012 were all-time record-setting years. 2011, we had 14 individual weather disasters that each cost more than $1 billion. I think total damage was about $54 billion in that year. 2012 had slightly fewer, but was still a record, especially in terms of cost, because it went out with a real bang with Hurricane Sandy, which by itself killed 140 people, and I think was something on the order of $60 billion worth of damage. Okay? And what we know is that many people are beginning to connect the dots. There's an old saying that if something happens once, it's happenstance. If it happens twice, it's a coincidence. If it happens 3 times, well, that's the beginning of a pattern. If it happens 4 times, 6 times, 12 times, 17 times, 22 times, 26 times, many people start going, wow, what's going on here? Could this have something to do with climate change? And in fact, what we find, and this is data from last November, is that over half the country believes that global warming is now affecting weather in the United States. And moreover, they even have been linking climate change with specific events. Rightly or wrongly from a scientific standpoint, by the way. People themselves are not waiting to be told what to think by scientists or the media. They're making these connections themselves because they're experiencing these themselves. 8 out of 10 Americans tell us that they have personally experienced one or more of these disasters in the past couple of years. A third of Americans say that they've been personally harmed, either physically harmed or property damage or something financial in relation to these events. So one of the things that these events do, and that I would argue, is that it's not simple. It's not like suddenly someone experiences a drought or a flood and they suddenly go, okay, now I'm with you. It's happening and it's really serious and I'm ready to go. What do we do? It's not usually that straightforward. But what it does do is it's a teachable moment. It's one of the rare times that we change our attention from American Idol or our favorite sports team or what our kids are doing at school, etc., and for a moment thinking about a topic that does have a direct connection to climate change. And people are asking this question. What does this have to do with climate change? Is this happening here and now? Okay. Also interestingly is where Americans fall out on some of the solutions to this. So in particular, and this has been very consistent, we find that majorities of Americans across party lines support some of the key policies that would be required. More research into renewable energy sources. Everybody likes clean energy. Just about everybody likes clean energy. There has grown up a very small and very vocal minority that have said things like Solyndra, 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 Solyndra. Have you heard of Solyndra? Etc. That's not most people. Most people really want this clean energy future. Nobody likes the idea of burning coal. They want that clean energy future. In fact, they tell us they want to start that clean energy right now. Providing tax rebates for people who purchase energy-efficient vehicles or solar panels. Pretty popular. Regulating CO2 as a pollutant. This is the biggie. This is the one that the Obama administration, because they can't get legislation out of Congress, is going to pursue. Having the EPA regulate CO2. This is it. This is the biggie that you're going to hear about over the next year. It's going to be a huge fight. Americans have consistently supported this. Now, I'm not saying that that's strong, unmovable support, because they haven't really heard the argument yet, which is just getting started. But the basic predisposition is that they like this idea. Eliminating all subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. Pretty strong support for that. Requiring electric utilities to produce 20% of their electricity from renewable energy, even if it costs the average household $100 a year. Americans are like, okay, I'm willing to do that. But as you'll see in a second, I'm only willing to do it so far. So what are the things that we all agree that we oppose? Increasing gas taxes by 25 cents a gallon, even if we returned all that revenue by reducing the federal income tax. We just don't like gas taxes. And this has always been a long-standing concern I've had with my good friends and colleagues on the economic side who say, look, we've got to have a carbon tax. It's the most efficient economic way to go. And I go, okay, but is it politically sustainable? Can we get it passed? And we've actually been finding that there are ways to talk about this and frame it that actually get people somewhat engaged, but it's like an anaphylactic shock or something, that when people hear the words tax, they just kind of immediately go, no. At the same time, people also are opposed to eliminating all federal subsidies for the renewable energy industry. So a majority do like eliminating subsidies for fossil fuels, but not for clean energy. Quickly?
Yeah, the dollar figure here is higher than in the previous slide.
That was my
Which
point.
do you think drives this difference?
So that was my point. So this actually was a number that we did. Actually, I think this number originally came out of the work we did with Joe Aldi, because it was the baseline number for what Waxman Markey would actually cost the average household. So anyway, as you can see here, that when you put that dollar figure in here and you use the word carbon tax, you get a majority of Americans who oppose this particular idea, even though it's requiring companies that produce these to pay a carbon tax. Okay? So it gets complicated. All right. The other thing that we learned very early in our research is that Americans don't speak with a single voice on this issue. Okay? And in fact, in our research, we've identified what we call global warming 6 Americans, that there are 6 very different parts of this country, not geographic, communities of the mind, essentially, that are very different. And let me introduce them to you. The first is a group we call the alarmed. This is 16% of the public. These are people who are convinced it's happening, it's human caused, it's serious and urgent. They strongly support policy action. And they are your potential, underscore, bolded, italicized, potential issue public. That segment of the public that gets organized to demand change. That's about 40 million Americans. 40 million people. But we know that many of them feel relatively isolated and alone. They say, I feel this strongly. Some of my friends and family feel this strongly, but they don't know that there are 40 million other people who feel as powerfully as they do. Okay. And that number is actually as big or bigger than many of the other issue publics you're aware of. Pro or anti-guns. Pro or anti-immigration, pro-choice or anti-abortion movements. Okay? The difference being is that those are organized movements, whereas the climate change movement is not yet organized. There are nascent pieces out there. Yes, there's 350, and yes, there are Citizens Climate Lobby and others, but it is not yet gelled to the critical mass that's going to be required. Then a group that we call the concerned, 27%. These are people that it's happening, human cause, serious, but again, distant. Distant in time, distant in space, so they consider it a lower priority. A group we call the cautious, and about another quarter, these are people who are still on the fence. They're paying attention, but haven't really figured it out. Is it happening? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious? Or is it kind of overblown? I'm not really sure, but paying attention. Then a group, 5%, very interesting, we call the disengaged. People have heard of global warming, but don't know anything about it. Over and over they tell us, I don't know what causes it. I don't know what the impacts are going to be. Certainly don't know what the solutions are. So basic awareness is their key barrier. Then a group we call the doubtful. These are people who say, I don't think it's happening. But if it is, it's probably just natural. Nothing humans have anything to do with. Nothing we can do anything about. So I don't think about it very much. It's not really a risk. And then last but not least is a group we call the dismissive. They're firmly convinced it's not happening. It's not human caused. It's not a serious problem. And again, about 3/4 of them give us those conspiracy type responses. Okay. Now note, they're only 15%. Let me say that again. They're only 15%. But they're a really loud 15%. They're really vocal 15%. They're 15% that's more than well represented in the halls of Congress. Okay. So one of the first rules of effective communication, or education for that matter, is know thy audience. If you don't know who you're speaking to and where they are right now, then it's very difficult for you to know exactly what to say. Because they're all grappling with this issue from a very different starting point. So here's just one example of that. We've asked people, we've asked the American public, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, what question would you ask? Well, down here, the doubtful and dismissive, the main question they want to know is, how do you know that it's happening your human cause? They're back at square one. Does this even exist? Whereas these groups, their main question is, okay, maybe it's happening, but so what? Why should I care? What harm is it going to cause? Whereas these folks, they'll say, okay, I got it. It's happening. It's human cause. It's serious. But what do we do? What do we do about this? Three completely different conversations happening in this country at the same time.
And it's interesting the gender balancing happens.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for pointing that out. Don't overinterpret that. So these groups are slightly more likely to be women. This group is much more likely to be men, but not exclusively. And so thank you for bringing it up, because I want you to not overinterpret these pictures. There are women in this group. There are African Americans and Asians and all sorts of different types in this group, as there are in all of these.
You're really going to have to overeducate me in order not to overinterpret this.
Okay. So anyway, these are groups that are defined by their beliefs, their attitudes, their behavior. Okay, so how do they break out when it comes to policy? So here, let's look at CO2, regulating CO2 as a pollutant. Here they line up just like you would expect. The alarm, very supportive of this. The dismissive, very much opposed to it. Likewise, regulations that force electrical utilities to produce 20% of their electricity from renewable sources. Again, the alarm love this, the dismissive hate it. Okay? Just what we would expect. But then look over here. Look at renewable energy research. Everybody supports this. Likewise, fuel-efficient vehicles and solar panels support. Everybody supports that. Not to the same degree, but their support. Now, why is that? Why is that? Okay, well, it's easy to understand. The alarming concerns support clean energy because they care about climate change, among other things. They want clean energy. These people don't believe climate change even exists. So why do they want clean energy? Because clean energy also has the benefit of resonating with their values. Okay? One of the things that we've seen very clearly over years is that a lot of what drives this is values. The values that the alarm tend to have very strongly are egalitarian values. They tell us they care a lot about affirmative action and eradicating poverty and that unequal distribution of income both within country and around the world. Those kinds of issues. They don't have anything to do with climate change. And yet the more you have that worldview and that value system, the more you care about climate change. Whereas the people down here have strong individualistic worldview. It's about individual autonomy, individual freedom. Get the government out of our way. Get the government off our backs. Regulation is bad. Taxation is bad. In popular terms, this is the libertarian or the Tea Party movement. Right? Now these
values in there too a little bit.
What's that?
Moral values in there a little bit.
That's in there too. It gets a little complicated. If you want, let's talk about religious values and how that plays into it, because that's actually a very interesting story. But in particular, it's this. The fact is that we see that the alarmed are very concerned about climate change because they're afraid of the impacts of climate change. These folks are also concerned about climate change, but not because they think climate change is real. They're afraid of the policy response. Okay?
Well, Douglas Waldavsky were afraid of climate change too.
What's that?
Douglas Waldavsky, whose theory...
Oh, Waldavsky, yeah, right.
They were aware of the problem 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In the 20 years since, if anything, the gap between the two cultures of FOX and the green bubble obviously has opened further.
That's right.
What can be done, if anything, to restore a constructive dialogue between the two isolated outliers?
It's the broader question of how do we depoliticize this issue. And that's really that's a tough one. If I had the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here. But it's a great one, and let's come back to that if we can. So one of the things, though, that we see here, which is part of the answer, is that they see their values at stake here, too. Okay? It's about energy independence. It's about self-reliance. Okay? I'm sitting here in Massachusetts right now. This is like transcendentalist land. This is Emerson. Okay? Very American, deep cultural values here. Self-reliance. And having lived through Hurricane Irene, Snowstorm Nemo, and then Sandy, and I've lost power for about 10 days at a time in those, and I'm sure many others in this room can identify. I wish I had my own energy source. I don't like being dependent on a big centralized energy producer for my power. Right? So for many of these folks, they see this as a way of resonating with their values. And there's actually a wonderful example of this in Georgia. Okay? In Georgia, you've got an unholy alliance between the Sierra Club and the Tea Party. Let me say that again. The Sierra Club and the Tea Party, who have joined forces, and they call themselves, are you ready for this? The Green Tea Party. They joined forces because they wanted to fight the central utility in Georgia that was fighting the ability of homeowners to put solar panels on their roof and to put that power back into the grid. The monopoly utility wanted all of that right and responsibility and the ability to sell that power to themselves. The Sierra Club and the Tea Party joined forces to fight the monopoly utility in Georgia, and they beat them. And now they're working together on other issues. Do they agree about everything? No, they do not. But they found ways to, and this is the whole art of politics, is finding policies that very different groups can support, albeit for completely different reasons, and putting together a coalition of sometimes strange bedfellows. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about very quickly here is this potential political movement. So we've asked Americans, how willing or unwilling would you be to join a campaign to convince elected officials to take action to reduce global warming? And I just want to put your attention to this box. This is just the alarm and the concern. And in the dark red are those that say they are already doing this, or that they definitely would do this. And in the red are those that say they probably would do it. Okay? So let's just throw out the probablys. They're just telling us this on a survey. They don't really mean it. So let's just be conservative and throw them right out and only focus on those that say that they are or definitely would. That's 20 million people. 20 million Americans who say they are ready to join a campaign because they're so concerned about this issue. Now, to put that into context, how many actual volunteer members of the Tea Party are there in this country? Now, I don't mean sympathizers. I mean actual members of local or statewide or national Tea Party groups that actually go to meetings. Now remember, 260 million American adults. Tea Party's had a very large impact, I would argue, on our politics. So what would you guess? How many people?
5 million.
5 million. You want
Less than a million.
Less than a million. Anyone want to go higher?
400,000.
400,000. Try 200,000. 200,000. There's 20 million here, but they're not organized. So then when he says, so how willing would you be to take action if you were asked by a person you like and respect? Here are the kind of things people will do. Easy to sign a petition, right? That doesn't ask much of you. This is a little more interesting. Sign a pledge to vote only for candidates that share your views about global warming. Would that send a signal? Attend public meetings or presentations about the issue. Writing letters or email or phoning your government officials about it. Volunteering with an organization, and then still kind of stunning to me, would you personally engage in nonviolent civil disobedience against corporations or government activities that are making global warming worse? That 5% right there of all Americans, that's about 13 million people who say they would do that. Wow. And who can convince...
Is that really true?
Let me finish. So who can convince Americans to take action to reduce global warming? This also is very important. What do we find? It's not elected officials. It's not religious leaders. It's not environmental leaders and so on. It's our own friends and family. In the end, for all the power of social media and television and powerful celebrities and all of that, most of us are really affected by the people in our own lives. It's our significant others. It's our kids. It's our friends. But we also know, because we've asked this repeatedly, most people don't talk about it. They just don't talk about it. Either because they're afraid to talk about it, or because they don't think everyone else wants to talk about it. There are all kinds of barriers. But the fact is, if we don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. So the one thing that I think we all can do doesn't require you to fly to DC and knock on the door of your senator and lobby them to take action. That's hard for some people to do, and that's fine. But everybody can talk to somebody. And I don't mean go find your crazy uncle who's the hardcore dismissive. That's a hard person to talk to. I'm talking about turn to the person next to you, your best friend, and talk about it. It's not that hard. Okay, so just to wrap up, as I've described, public understanding did decline from 2008 to 2010. It certainly changed the national political climate, but we've seen this bounce back in the past couple of years. Nonetheless, there still is majority public support for some of the policies that are on the table. Importantly, that you've got to always remember there are these different audiences, and they each come at this issue from a very different perspective, and the facts are actively interpreted by each of these groups, who are always constructing their own understanding in accordance to what they already know or think they know, their underlying values, and their feelings about the issue. And this issue does generate intense emotions sometimes, of all different kinds. And we have to navigate that. We have to be able to talk about that. It's not just the science. Knowledge is necessary, but it's insufficient. Emotions, values, ideology, and all these broader political, social, and economic forces are also shaping the way we respond to this. And then in terms of just a few suggestions, there are many more, we need to be talking about the fact that the experts agree. It's a critical gateway belief. The more people understand that the experts do in fact agree, the more they in turn say, well, then I think it's probably real, and I think it's probably bad, and I support policy. That there are human consequences. This isn't about polar bears. And that there are links to the things that we're experiencing in our own backyards today. And then critically, that the problem is in fact solvable. And then last thing I'll just say is please just talk about it. And with that, come visit us. Thank you.